I'm going to introduce a different kind of loop now called a for loop. So a for loop is just another way of achieving a result. It has advantages and disadvantages depending on your application. So consider this example here where we ask the user for a number and it just counts to that number using a while loop and outputs every number along our way. With a for loop, now for loops are slightly different. You see this while loop here, we defined a variable just above it, and then we increment this variable by 1 every single time this while loop iterates. And when the condition is false, it breaks out of it. So you can see here we've added some extra stuff to the while loop in order for the while loop to achieve its goal. Now a for loop, it has an inbuilt mechanism which includes a counter just like this. And it's going to simplify all of this code into one for statement. Now, what does all that mean? Let me explain. So we start a for loop with the for keyword, just like that. And then the header is in brackets, just like the while loop. And then we have the curly braces. So the header for a for loop, it actually has an extra little bit of information. So the while loop here, we have the condition. That's the only thing we have in here. But the for loop, it actually requires the definition of the counter and the incrementer of the counter. So the header requires 3 things. And that's because the for loop manages our counter for us, so it needs to know about this information. But it also needs to know the condition, and that's how we enter and exit the for loop, for example, just like a while loop. So it needs 3 things of, 3 pieces of information. So I'm going to use exactly the same names here, maybe with a number 1 afterwards, so I can't use variables with the same name. So I'm going to copy the where we initialized our counter here, and I can't have the same name, so I'll just put a number 1 after it. The next thing I need is the condition, and we separate these 3 items using a semicolon. So then I put the condition, again I can't have the same name. And then the last one, I need the incrementer. And again, I can't have the same name as the while loop above. So now this is basically exactly the same thing as above, apart from this line here, which I'll put here. Now this block here does exactly the same thing as all of this here. So you can see the advantage in this case of a for loop over a while loop. That's because it keeps track of our counter for us. And automatically behind the scenes, every time the for loop iterates, this counter is incremented by 1 every time. If we want to, we could increment it by 2 every time. So we go counter equals counter 1 plus 2. And that'll increment the counter by 2 every time, for example. We could increment it by 8 every time. It's really up to us what we want to do with the incrementer, but typically you'll see people increment it by 1 every time. There are certain cases where you might want to decrease the value by 1 every time. It's really up to you. So that's our incrementer, the 3rd item. The middle item is our condition, so it's exactly the same as a while loop in that case. And the first item is where we define our counter. So we need to say, hey, we're setting up a new variable and we initialize it to 1 in this case. We can initialize it to 0 if we want, but we do have to initialize it. We can't leave it blank. So we initialize it to 1 in this case, and this will do exactly the same thing as this piece of code here. So let me just demonstrate that now. So here's our while loop. We're going to enter the number 7, why not? And you can see it counts to 7. Now I'm going to remove our while loop completely and put in our cool, broken down for loop, a lot less lines of code. So I'm going to run the application, I'm going to put the number 7, and it does exactly the same thing as the while loop. It's pretty cool, isn't it?